Today, we are honored to have Professor Greg Clark to share with us on a short history of global cities. Professor Clark is one of the global advisors, author, and expert in urban development, city economies, globalizations, smart cities, and planning strategies. Professor Clark is the chairman of the Business of Cities Limited, a global trading advisory team based in London. He regularly chairs summits on development issues and moderates for leadership forums such as the World Cities Summit's Mayors Forum. Professor Clark has authored 10 publications on urban economic developments. Today's lecture topic, A Short History of Global Cities, is one of his latest books, and it examines the enduring force of trade, new technologies, and shifting geopolitics that enable some cities to achieve global recognition and influence. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Professor Clark, followed by a Q&A session moderated by Dr. Chua Yang Liang. Dr. Chua has more than 20 years of research and planning-related experience, and he currently heads the research and strategy team in ARA Asset Management. Without further ado, we would like to invite Professor Greg Clark to deliver his presentation on the short history of global cities. Professor Clark, please.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thank you to all of you who've braved the beautiful warm weather outside to come and sit in this rather cool room with no natural light for the next hour and a half and talk about cities. I'm particularly grateful to CLC and particularly to Kuteng Chai and his team for inviting me to do this, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Chua Yang Liang, who's going to moderate the conversation that we have afterwards. Usually when I come to Singapore for CLC, I'm here to moderate the World Mayors Forum. And one of the tasks I'm given when we do that is to introduce 120 mayors in about 10 minutes, which is a very difficult thing to do. And so it's a pleasure today to have a few more minutes to talk about the things that the mayors are involved with and what they do. I'm going to be referring to two recent books which I've written or co-written. The first book that I'll say a little bit about at the beginning is called World Cities and Nation States, which was published in January of this year, which essentially tries to track the changing political discourse between the notion of a world city or a globalizing city, and particularly notions about the nation state and reflections particularly upon the current surge in sort of populist and anti-global sentiment. And then the second book I'm going to talk about for most of the time is The Short History of Global Cities, which was published by the Brookings Institution just at the end of last year. Now, the Brookings Institution is 100 years old, and so it's celebrating its centenary. And in order to have this centenary celebrations, they decided to commission a series of short history books. So this includes books that will cover the short history of the family, the short history of money, the short history of religion. And the first three books were intended to be, number one, the short history of marijuana. But for various reasons, this book has proved very slow coming off the press and hasn't yet been published. And then the second one was supposed to be the short history of corruption, but this one has been lost without trace, and nobody can find it. So the first book that was actually published was the short history of global cities. So I was very pleased about that. Now, why talk to you about these two themes? Why indeed spend months of one's time writing books on these subjects? And I suppose that the reason that I agreed to write the Brookings book and secondly prepare the book on world cities and nation states is that I suppose I feel that we've come to the end of a cycle of political consensus about globalization and cities, which has been disrupted for a whole series of reasons. But we haven't, in my mind, come in any sense at all to the end of the developmental cycle of cities and globalization. So we're challenged with a kind of disjuncture between a political narrative that is moving us towards thinking what's next, we're post the global city, and on the other hand, we're in a development phase in the world economy, the growth particularly of Asia Pacific, the rise and emergence of new urban systems that I think are very important for us to continue to track and to continue to study and to be engaged with. So as you'll see as I go through, I think the flavor of this talk will be something of a catch-up on the global city thinking, but also a conversation with you, I hope, about how that global cities conversation emerges in the future, what it means in the future, the new themes and the priorities it adapts, and some of the tactical issues to do with researching and communicating about globalizing cities. Now, to put all of this in context, let me start with a personal perspective very quickly. So I think that we're 1/3 of the way through a 100-year cycle in which that cycle is probably the most significant cycle in human history if your subject is geography. And if your subject is geography, then what I think you're preoccupied with is that during this 100-year cycle, humankind is moving from being about 15 to 20% living in cities to about 80% living in cities in a 100-year period, unprecedented in the 20,000, 25,000 year history of humanity that we understand and know about, certainly unprecedented in the recent 2, 3, 4 or 5,000 years. This great trek towards the urban and to the city is the single most important anthropological episode that the human race has ever been through. And we're 1/3 of the way through this century. So, to my mind, if you're interested in the location of humanity, its settlement patterns, the demographics, if you like, of settlement, and how the world emerges as an urban construct and how that will be supported and fueled, you have to be interested in this century. The second thing to say, of course, is that this trek towards the urban coincides with 3 other major trends that I think of as very important. The first one is obviously that human population is about to reach its peak. Sometime in the next 30 to 40 years, according to the demographers, birth rates and death rates will more or less stabilize. Population, life expectancy, as you know, continues to grow in most countries and will reach, as it were, peak humankind at around 7 billion in around 30 to 40 to 50 years' time. The third big and important cycle or big trend here, of course, is our climate emergency and the dangers that we now understand much better than we ever did before of shifting towards 1 or 2% average temperature rises around the world, and the impact that will have not just on our climate and our environment, but of course on our human settlements and our cities. And then, of course, the fourth great trend that's part of this cycle is the ubiquitous growth of exponential technologies. Technologies in relation, of course, to life sciences and DNA, in relation to automation, in relation to the internet, big data, artificial intelligence, ubiquitous technologies emerging, of course, in relation to energy systems as well. And indeed, rather more mundane technologies about water and water management, waste and waste management. So my feeling is overall that we're living with a kind of interesting jigsaw puzzle, and we're 1/3 of the way through the century in which we're trying to piece this together, where we're trying to combine this shift towards the urban with the tools that emerge from the new technologies, the imperatives that come from the climate emergency, and at the same time the promise of population stabilization at the global level. Now, to my mind, what that means is that next 30 to 40 years become very important years in establishing what our long-term relationship is going to be with climate and the planet. Very important in terms of establishing where and what the human population centers are going to be, and in particular, which infrastructures are going to support and reinforce them. What are the patterns of trade and exchange and mutual innovation that will come from a global system of cities that has a settled population, rather than a population that's still continuing to grow and expand. So it's a very, very exciting time to be thinking about these things. And for these reasons, it's very difficult for me to embrace anything other than a global agenda around them, because to do so would be a kind of derogation of responsibility. Now, it's not just me mentioning these ideas to you. I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with the OECD trying to track the role of global urbanization and how that's begun to develop and evolve, and whether you call it the Metropolitan Century or you think about the century of cities, a huge range of new insights about the governance and leadership of cities and metropolitan areas have emerged. From our friends at the UN, of course, we get great data now on human population settlements, what peak humanity will look like, what shape and form it might take in terms of settlements increasingly observed there. We know from our friends at the McKinsey Institution that the global economic center of gravity is shifting back towards the south and the east as a result of these changes that we're talking about. And we know from our friends at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that there are big plans about how to shape this new settlement, how to change the spatial economy that we live in, and how to set up, as it were, a new economic geography through the deployment of capital into large-scale infrastructure moving forward. So this century of urbanization brings forward many challenges. Here's UN Habitat again, beginning to talk about the key challenges involved in trying to, as it were, unleash the promise or the potential of cities. And whilst we talk a huge amount about population change in cities and population growth, there's also a parallel agenda emerging very rapidly about the changing relationships between cities and business, whether it's the urbanization of capital and the mass growth of real estate and fixed infrastructure as now an investable asset, or whether it's the particular role of cities in the innovation economy, or whether it's the new global industry of the rise of traded global urban services, the advanced urban services of engineering, architecture, logistics, infrastructure, urban design, and energy that are all part of the nexus that is city building, city making, and city management, a great new globalizing industry emerging, as it were, before our eyes there. I'm also minded to observe that these current trends give rise to some rather obvious observations about the changing nature of urban economies. And I'm not going to talk in any great detail about this. Suffice to say that if you go to any city and ask what's new or what's happening in relation to urban change, you'll hear something about either the sharing economy, where obviously the conversation is about how technology platforms enable us to use particular kinds of resources, assets, or amenities in different ways. And if you dig a little bit more deeply, you'll discover that the sharing economy is actually highly profitable for a very small number of people, so it's sharing in only a certain kind of way. But what you'll also hear, I think, is that the sharing economy is pro-urban. It's pro-density, it's pro-mixed use, it's pro the reuse of urban land and assets. The sharing economy creates, as it were, a new premium for public space, for urban design, a new kind of urban livability, which the sharing economy somehow underpins, but also in a certain way requires. You'll hear a lot about the emergence of the urban circular economy, the economy that involves, of course, food and water and waste and energy and construction materials and all of those things that we need, in a sense, for the metabolism of the city to really emerge and work. And what we discover here, of course, is that this is having a huge impact on changing energy, water, food systems and the drive towards much more integrated governance in cities. The third new urban economy, if you like, is the experience economy. That series of connected activities that are somehow the offline response to the online world, that so many of the routinized activities in any urban economy of exchange now are now processed through digital platforms. The experience economy is about creating or recreating the value and the interaction of the face-to-face activity. The activities that include, of course, an experiential retail, live entertainment, community engagement, all sorts of leisure and sports and other kinds of popular activities, but from the urban point of view, place great prominence on things like public space, place-making, creating urban environments in which people want to live, to dwell, to breathe, to interact with each other, as it were, repositioning the appeal of the physical, not as convenience in the sense that it's an easy place to transact, but the physical environment as somehow the habitat of interaction between people. And then this fourth great new economy, the innovation economy, the ubiquitous use of platform-based technologies and new big data, other kinds of systems to create again within some cities the new ecosystems for entrepreneurship, for business growth, sometimes for very high growth companies, but particularly for the commercialization of knowledge. And we learn that the role of cities in all of this, of course, is about mastering the advantages of proximity, of interaction, of accidental cooperation and participation between different groups of people. Now, I'm saying all of this to you because I want to underpin why it's worth thinking about the emergence and, of course, the next cycle of globalization and cities, because these agendas, it seems to me, are driven by much longer term drivers and changes, the ubiquitous technologies, the stabilization of human population, the growth of these four new great economies, than some of the other things that we currently pay attention to in the media. So we've learned a lot, I think, from recent studies about the relationship between city size and city growth. If you like, agglomeration and its advantages. We'll come back to disadvantages in a minute. But if you like, the positive externalities that come in an urban economy from being able to house these kinds of urban interactions I've just been talking about, and all of the benefits both to employers and to workers of proximity and being close to each other. But of course, agglomeration also gives rise to negative externalities, the things that, if you like, are the challenge not just to productivity, but also to livability, from congestion to pollution to noise to affordability, to all of those things that have become, in a sense, the banners and the slogans of the anti-globalization movement. We would, I think, describe, in my way of thinking about them, as negative externalities to do with unmanaged or not well-managed processes of urbanization. That's also true if you look at the national level. Urbanization, although we know from the studies that have been undertaken at the global level, is generally associated with rising income levels, higher standards of living, the reduction of poverty, improvements of public health. Urbanization is not always well managed by every nation. So the challenge, in a sense, here is to equip all nations to some level with the tools of managing good urbanization, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion. So just to finish off this section of the talk, I think we can see whether the issue is climate change or whether it's the desire of the UN through its Sustainable Development Goals now to embrace cities, that there's a very high expectation of the promise of what cities can deliver, but there's a big question mark about whether all cities have the tools and the policies, and whether nation states have the managerial capabilities to manage urbanization effectively. So one of the things I've become enormously obsessed by is the comparative competencies and powers of different kinds of city governments. So here is a very notional, as it were, power thermometer of city governments. You can see Singapore right up the top, close to its near neighbor and friend Hong Kong. And if we were to fill in all of the detail in this list, the Swiss cantons would probably come next, and then we'd move into some of the North American cities, and eventually we'd get down to cities in countries which I know rather well, like Ireland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Top end, very high levels of empowerment of city government for obvious reasons. Bottom end, very low levels of empowerment for city government. My simple point to you is that this spectrum of rather differential powers and competencies of city governments begins to matter quite a lot when you start to add up this conversation about positive and negative externalities associated with urbanization. What's the toolbox for managing the negative externalities and dealing with them? It's something to do with city governments having the right kind of powers. So it's quite possible, alongside this inciting agenda about cities and globalization, all to have a very, I think, robust conversation about how much cities are underpowered. So this is the title of an article I wrote for the London School of Economics, which was published last year, which simply made the obvious point that most cities don't have the right boundaries, most cities don't raise enough taxes, most cities do not have the levers of control of development, most cities are controlled by higher tiers of government, most nations do not have national urban policies. So the challenge here, in a sense, is to accept that there's a long way to go in terms of equipping and tooling cities and governments to do this. So in the first book, World Cities and Nation States, what we tried to do was to, in a sense, develop an argument that's rather different to the argument of the late, great Benjamin Barber. What Benjamin said, and there's always a risk of paraphrasing somebody you disagree with, but what I think he said is that the world would essentially be better off if there was a global parliament of mayors and if mayors ruled the world. And my obvious response to this was to say, well, it would be great if that were possible, but wouldn't we want the mayors to have the powers they need to do it? In other words, it's not so much that we're living in an age of city-states, it's that we're living in an age of cities, but none of them have the power of states. So this age has inherited all of the governance framework, it seems to me, of the nation-state century. And we're not yet at a position where many cities, and it's easy, I think, to forget this, perhaps if you're in Singapore, where you are able to think about joined-up government operating in concert around a single set of priorities with a long-term vision and a whole balance sheet that it manages itself. It's easy to forget that most cities don't find themselves in that position, and therefore the challenges, I think, are rather different. So this has led us into a series of conversations about national systems of cities. If you like, the proposition of this book, the one on the left-hand side, is that whether or not the next century is a successful century of urbanization depends upon the flexibility with which national governments and cities invest in creating some new negotiated settlements with each other. In other words, it's all about the deal that they're able to strike. It's not about the mayors setting up a parliament of their own, in my opinion. That's led us to a whole series of conversations about national systems of cities. That's also led us into being quite interested in one of the new developments in national urban policies, which is this approach to city deals. And if I can use the slightly more technical language here, I would say that many nations are locked in a low investment, low trust equilibrium, where national governments don't trust cities and cities don't trust national governments. And what's interesting about the city deal approach, adopted, of course, firstly by France, then by Canada, then by Sweden, previously, of course, by Finland, and now by the UK, now by Australia, now by the Netherlands, is that it's an approach, as it were, to step out of that path dependency of low trust, low cooperation equilibrium, and try to find a basis to build some higher aspirations. And the way they do that is by having a negotiation that has 5 key elements in it. You know, a whole of government approach negotiated around a customized arrangement for each city. In other words, each city gets what it needs. A growth and improvement appetite on the part of the city or the metropolitan area to do better and do more, and on that basis to earn the right to have more power. A series of mechanisms that capture the value that's created from good urbanization and recycle it. Institutional reforms that are designed to guarantee better outcomes from urban development processes, and then some kind of transformative investment that's made up front. In other words, it seems to me that this approach, the city deals approach, has some of the opportunities within it to step out of this low trust, low investment path dependency and to establish, as it were, a higher path for some cities and some governments that are willing to say, this isn't working, let's do something different. Now, in the second book, which I want to talk about briefly for a few minutes now, I was asked to kind of write a short history of global cities, which is, you know, you face a choice when you're asked to do this. Option 1 is to go back to 1961 when the great Professor Sir Peter Hall first used the term world cities in a document, and to start to say, well, where did Peter get that from? And then you can go back, of course, to Geddes and to others and see that the notion of a world city really came out of post-imperial Europe in the early parts of the 20th century, and you could write a history based on that. Or you could do what I decided to do and say, well, what are the antecedents of the global city in history, and where does this come from looking further back? Doing that in a few short pages is a rather difficult thing to do. So this is what we did. We decided to look back at particular cycles where globalization, in other words, cross-border activity, seemed to intensify, and we looked at the dominant regimes, powers or empires that were in place at the time, the mechanisms that they used to diffuse technologies of various kinds, from navigation to boat building to the creation of currencies. And then we asked ourselves, what was the role of individual and groups of cities in the innovations that came about during these periods? And so the central thesis of the book, if you like, is something like this, that the desire on the part of these cities and the regimes that led them to be part of a process of trade, in other words, to see the impetus to trade as a means to achieve advantage, led to them having to innovate. And many of the innovations were to do with transport, or they were to do with exchange, or currencies, or insurance, or regulations, or navigations, or other things. And that having established that in order to trade they needed to innovate, then what happened was that the innovations themselves began to attract other kinds of engagement, businesses, merchants, partners of various kinds. And the innovation processes themselves led to accelerated urbanization. In other words, the fact that something different was happening and the fact that what was happening was able to create value, was able to facilitate exchange, led to large numbers of people wanting to join those communities and be part of them in order to share in the innovations. That, of course, then led to growing cities. And those cities then began to specialize, to cluster, to achieve some of these benefits of agglomeration, as well as the negative externalities, which we'll talk about as well. And then because there was this link between trade innovation and cities, cities then started to organize in groups, either through imperial structures or through other structures, in order to promote trade. In other words, there's this positive triangle of reinforcement between trade, innovation, urbanization, and cities and their growth. And this really is the central thesis that then underpins the whole book, and allows us to look at this history in a very particular way. Not a history that's told exactly chronologically, but is told in terms of the suites of innovations undertaken within each cycle, the waves or the groups of cities that participated, and then the paths that they took to make this work. So if we were to summarize the book very quickly, and I'll motor ahead after this, in the 183 pages where we try to summarize all of this, there are 5 recurring ingredients of the globalizing cities that appear to emerge. So the first one is trade and connectivity. The instinct to trade leads to the desire to be better connected, and that leads to all of these new kinds of connections that I've talked about. The desire to trade also attracts populations that are not otherwise there, and they also encourage openness. So diverse and entrepreneurial populations arrive, migrants, merchants, entrepreneurs, other kinds of people, to participate in this city that's decided to be open to these global flows. Because of the arrival of these people, the processes of innovation are spurred and accelerated, and that gives the city greater influence. It allows it, as it were, to generate some soft power, despite the fact that it's just a city, because that soft power allows it to organize trade, to, as it were, to license and to franchise particular kinds of innovations. And then that leads into the instinct to constantly discover or to colonize, depending upon the period we're talking about, new markets, to build trade routes, and to establish connectivity that wasn't there before. And then that leads to the ability of these places to take advantage of geopolitical opportunity and change. Now, the reason I spend a few minutes spelling all of that out is because it seems to me that whether we're talking about Alexandria, or we're talking about Baghdad, or we're talking about Berlin in the 19th century, or we're talking about Singapore today, these same 5 key ubiquitous ingredients seem to me to reinforce themselves. And even before we had a theory of world cities and global cities, it's the connection of these 5 elements of trade and connectivity, openness and diversity, innovation and influence, discovery of new markets, and geopolitical opportunity that make the notion of a global city or a globalizing city work. So we talk quite a bit about why that's important today. I don't need to go into all of that. And then we observe these cycles, paths, and waves in terms of their historical and chronological context and the particular technologies and geopolitical environments that they participated in. And we're trying to make the point, if you like, that cities on the whole don't globalize on their own. They globalize as part of groups where there's a high level of interaction between those groups, and some of them indeed are organized as leagues. Then the conversation in the book gets rather detailed, and I don't think I'm going to take you through all of this. Suffice to show you that there are roughly 10-page sections that go through the history in some detail, identifying the particular cities that participated in these forms of trade, the connectivity, the innovations, the migrants, the diversity, the merchants that they attracted, the ways in which they generated their influence in new markets, and then how they took advantage of particular opportunities. And if you remember the One Belt, One Road map I showed you about 20 years ago, and you think about what I'm now going to show you, I think it's very obvious to see that this notion of the next cycle, the next wave, the next group of global cities that will globalize is very much being planned and articulated, in a sense, through that and through some other programs. So there's the Royal Road, the Phoenician trade routes, the Silk Roads, the Hanseatic League, the Ming Dynasty, the Atlantic slave trade, and in total we get down to these kind of 10 waves with all of these different cities participating in them. And you can see for many cities there's a process of globalization, deglobalization, and then re-globalization, and I guess Istanbul would be the perfect example of that, having been Byzantine, Constantinople, and Istanbul, and having played all of those different roles. And then some particular cities seem to us to stand out as exemplifying the different kinds of global cities of their day. So we talk in the book in some detail about Alexandria, Baghdad, Guangzhou, the example of the first kind of forced global city. We talk about the development of finance in Amsterdam, Vienna's role, if you like, as the cosmopolitan capital, the cultural global city, and then we talk about San Francisco, in a sense, as the first global city of the technological age and how that developed. Now, I've spared you all of the details, even though it would be interesting to go through them, partly because I want you to read the book, but partly because I've got other things I want to say to you right now, if I may. So there's another section of the book that looks at the understanding of global cities. This book is not a theory of global cities, because I don't think I'd be up for writing a theory. But what we do try to do is to trace the different ways in which the concept of a global city has been attended to. And broadly speaking, we observe 3, as it were, waves or phases of that. The first phase, associated with Peter Hall, John Friedman, and many others, is, as it were, this focus on the global city as the place of the transnational corporation, and the impact that the transnational corporation has both on the model of urban economic development and also on the form and function of the city, particularly the implications for corporate real estate. In the second wave, we focus more on the work of Saskia Sassen, Peter Taylor, Ed Soja, and others, where the focus here, of course, is on the globalization of professional services, as it were, what happened since roughly 1980. and the way in which that was intermingled with the growth of global diaspora and diversity populations in cities, and as it were, the growth of inequality in global cities, of barriers and mechanisms for participation. And then the third wave of global cities really focuses on the work of people like Alan Scott, Michele Acuto, and Ben Derrida, where we focus on some of the new concepts of things like urban diplomacy, global networks of cities, the whole notion of generating, as it were, soft power for cities through associations and through transnational networks, through global city policy exchanges and everything else. The other thing we try to do is to make some comment about the measurement of global cities, and this will be quite interesting because we put together the analysis that is rapidly developing at the OECD, at the World Bank, Brookings, McKinsey, the World Economic Forum, and others, with the growth of the global city sort of indexes, ranking, and benchmarking industry, which is something we study regularly. In 2016, when this slide was put together, there were 230 of these. I think this morning when I spoke to the team in London, they told me it's now 317 global city rankings, indexes, benchmarking studies. So if you like, I wouldn't want to refer to this really as an emerging science, but maybe it's the embryo before an emerging science of how to compare and contrast global cities and how they perform and everything else. So that comes in for an interesting piece. Now, this slide will take a little bit of explaining. But I want to make the observation that we decided in the book to spend a little bit of time trying to deal with categories and typologies of global cities. There are many, many, many different ways of categorizing, typologizing global cities, and these tools are more or less useful depending upon your preferences in terms of the kind of inquiry you're trying to engage with, and more or less robust depending upon your predilection for certain kinds of evidence. Let me start by saying every city is individual. No two cities are the same or alike. But we've tried to develop, based on a synthesis of all of the typologies, some kind of notion of a meta-typology of global cities. So just to be very, very quick about this. Top left-hand corner, established global cities, Singapore sitting in there, with other members of the top 6, which is rapidly becoming a kind of top 10, where, if you like, the predominant wave of global cities whose path was about embracing finance and professional services and media during that period of liberalization post-1980. So London, New York, Tokyo, Paris, Singapore, and Hong Kong emerge from that group as the leading group of global cities that perform those kinds of functions. Now, interestingly, of course, all of those cities perform other functions too, and rather different ones from one another. But this group of cities has a particular kind of dynamic and challenge, and obviously their big challenges at the moment are to firstly address the problems of growth, so to deal with the externalities of very fast-paced growth, particularly in relation to affordability, but there are also issues about community relations, there are issues about the scale and the pace of their infrastructure investments, there are issues about the extent to which they're adapting to a post-financialization cycle where other industries are now globalizing much more rapidly, principally industries that are driven by ubiquitous and exponential technologies. And if you like, for these cities, a big adjustment process is going on, as you know. All of these cities, or nearly all of these cities, you'll tell me whether you think this is true in Singapore, and I suspect it's not to the same degree. But the rest of these cities all have a housing crisis, a huge housing crisis, for reasons that'll be clear. The group of cities at the bottom, the emerging world cities, this is the group of cities that are the largest cities in the fastest growing and larger economies of the world. We used to think of these as being the emerging economies, but I think that terminology and conception is ludicrously out of date now. So what we're talking about is a group of cities that are the junction boxes with very, very large domestic markets, where they are, in a sense, in a new phase of globalization, even if they've globalized in the past, where the opportunity for these cities is to become centers where a large number of high-volume transactions occur, both in finance and business processes, but also in education processes through the role of their universities, in technology processes through their startup systems, and in diplomatic and media processes through their information systems and their broadcast capability. And for nearly all of these cities, the challenge is one of infrastructure catch-up, it's one of inequality, and it's one of proving, as it were, that they have the quality of the built environment and the business climate required to become genuinely global players. And you can, if you like, start to create lots of different leagues within that. Top right-hand corner, we've termed this the New World cities. What we're talking about here is cities that on the whole are smaller in size. If you like, the average size of these established world cities is somewhere between 5 and 15 million, with Tokyo being a bit of an outlier. The average size of these emerging world cities is somewhere between 10 and 20 million, with a few outliers there. And then the average size of these new world cities is less than 5 million. And their combination, if you like, is a more managed metropolis, coupled with a very high quality of life, and with specialization in a limited range of sectors where there's a high return for the deployment of technology and the use of high-value talent. In other words, it's combining livability with talent and technology in a kind of managed metropolis where you can guarantee a much higher quality of life. It's these cities that typically win all the high quality of life awards, as you know, whether they're in Australasia or they're in Middle Europe or Scandinavia or they're in the northwest corner of the North American continent. It's these groups of cities that are largely seen as those kinds of livable cities. So the reason for putting together this simple typology is partly to be able to show that there are lots of hybrids and crossovers. It's partly to be able to talk about the different kinds of paths that these cities are on and some of the challenges that they face. And it's partly to be able to start to predict how, as it were, this pattern of cities, this system of cities will begin to emerge. I'd like to stress that the presumption that we make is that some of these cities are at least as interested in cooperation with one another as they are in competition. So I'm not particularly interested in the dynamics of competition, but obviously there are different forms of competition between different kinds of cities depending upon where they sit. And in a way, that kind of approach allows us to illustrate some of the points I've been making about paths into globalization. Whether we take Barcelona or we take Singapore or Tel Aviv, these are all good examples of cities that have more or less consciously, more or less deliberately stepped through certain cycles of economic development where the activity that they've been trading in globally has changed and emerged as they've acquired the competencies and the resources, as it were, to move up the value chain or to do a switch in terms of their sector focus as part of their longer-term economic strategy. And I don't need to, I think, illustrate all of those. But this leads to the obvious point about the current moment of anti-globalization, and if you like, the particular comments that are widely made by some of the people who are the progenitors. From globalization is unjust and unfair, the benefits are exaggerated and the costs are not properly calculated, to national identity and sovereignty is being lost, immigration is out of control, therefore democracy is undermined. So metropolitan elites are in charge and they benefit, only the big cities benefit. I think you will have heard many of these and many others, and I'm not trying to deliberately be skeptical about them. But the point to make, I think, is that there's a characterization here of the global city or the globalizing city, which seeks to observe, I think, that it has failed to deal with, one, any of the externalities that occur outside of its borders, and two, it's failed to properly account for the costs and benefits of the globalization path and process itself. So everybody in the room has to make the decision about whether you think this moment of anti-globalization that we're in is going to be profound and deep, and we'll see a deep retrenchment, and as it were, we'll see an abandonment of this notion of increasingly liberalized trade and exchange policies giving rise to the next suite of global cities, or whether you think somehow we're going to get through this and establish that next cycle of globalization in a clear way. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that my view is basically that this is an interruption, it's a disruption, it will cause an important set of corrections that are actually needed and necessary. But I don't see globalization and the emergence of global cities as about to stop. In fact, I think we're on the crest of a new cycle in which there'll be many more globalizing cities, principally because people, capital, technology, tourism, and trade are still driving forces for all of us. And one of the implications of writing this book was to look back 5,000 years and observe that these impulses to trade, to enterprise, to innovate, to connect, for people to move and migrate, for places to become havens for people from different environments where innovations and trade would occur. This impetus is very deep in the human psyche, I think, and it's partly a reaction to the way in which states are formed and managed that this exists. But also, I think, as I said earlier, it requires a kind of new balance sheet or an adjustment in policies. And I think that begins to look something like this, that as we think about the policy prescription that moves forward, we need, of course, this story about the better run and better managed world city, which is the bit in the middle. But if we have that without a stronger focus at the national level of how all locations within a nation can benefit from participation in trade, and if we don't have, as it were, at the interregional level, something that's real in terms of partnership and cooperation between different kinds and sizes of cities, then I don't think we're going to get very far. Now, I've got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I want to end with some comments about Singapore, if I may. And the point I really want to make, and I'll say it very boldly up front, is that I think one of the huge successes of Singapore's journey to being this hugely successful international city today, from very unpromising starting points in 1965, is that Singapore has consistently, in solving and resolving its own problems through innovation, become a source of leadership and inspiration for other cities and other countries around the world. In other words, deep in the root of modern-day Singapore is the desire to achieve self-determination, achieve self-governance, to innovate to do that. And in the process of innovating to do that, Singapore has become a kind of beacon to the world. So you won't need me to tell you about all of the data, but whether it's foreign direct investment and talent and transportation and visitors, or whether we're looking more broadly across a whole series of indexes where you can see Singapore's now overtaken Paris and Hong Kong, or whether you're interested in financial services, or whether it's something to do with foreign direct investment and talent and the corporate environment, or whether it's to do with transport capacity and connectivity, or whether it's to do with any of these other things, the gateway functions, the ease of doing business, the transport infrastructure, the world measures Singapore as a global leader and sees Singapore's achievements in this space as being second to none. And the fact that so much has been achieved in a short 50-year period is quite amazing, only perhaps mirrored by the achievements in South Korea and Seoul in terms of the starting points and the progress made. But the world also looks at Singapore and asks a few questions too. This is PwC's version of the questions, which you may or may not like, but there's an issue here about costs. There's an issue here about demographics and livability, and it's interesting that the notions of livability, we now have at least 3 different ideas of livability that are at the heart of the way these different measures work. There are some measures that show Singapore the highest for livability. But livability to some is access to natural environment and amenity. For others, livability is somehow about cosmopolitanism. For others, livability is somehow about equality, participation, equity, sorts of issues. And Singapore scoring high, actually, on those last ones, but not scoring so high on some of the other issues to do with cosmopolitanism and to do with lifestyle. Sustainability in the natural environment, I mean, there's not much you can do if you're a relatively small island in terms of how some of these measures work. But in thinking about this and thinking about, Singapore's knowledge institutions, I mean, one of the things about the smart nation agenda, of course, is that in order to really be the smart nation at the global level, one is going to need to have a world-leading university system. And although Singapore's university system, of course, is a great university system, it is not yet one of the best in the world. And issues of scale obviously militate against that as well. So I was left with sort of some questions for Singapore moving forward, if you like, and my expectation for Singapore to be a leader in the next cycle of cities and globalization. What about these questions? What's the role of Singapore in the ongoing urbanization of Asia? In the last two cycles, Singapore's big play has been, this is the safe, civilized city in Asia. There's going to be a lot more safe, civilized cities in Asia. So what's the play for the next cycle for Singapore? I can imagine what that is, but I think it's a healthy question. And that really takes to root this idea of how does Singapore serve the urbanization process in the rest of Asia for the rest of this century that we're 1/3 of the way through. Very interesting kinds of questions. Lots of issues that Singapore faces, just like the other successful world cities, to do with the externalities associated with growth. And although Singapore has done brilliantly well in areas of healthcare and housing, these challenges, I think, will remain. Big question always for Singapore is, when does the emergence of the role of the non-governmental leaders become a force? Obviously, in other global cities, business institutions, civic leadership play a much more prominent role than they do so far in Singapore. And then we have the issue of the reform of state-owned enterprises, the investment rate, the sources of capital. When do we begin to see more private equity being invested here? Singapore, as I've already said, setting itself out, as it were, to become the leading new world city as well as the leading established world city. But is the ecosystem right for enterprise, creativity, and innovation? Is the entrepreneurial drive there to really make that happen? The knowledge institutions we just spoke about, expansion of the brand seems to be very key. And then, of course, as all cities, addressing flexibility and resilience. So this is not a series of challenges for Singapore. It's more a series of questions I have about what Singapore's next cycle will be as we look at the next increment in Singapore's path towards becoming a successful global city. Now, this is the last slide. Singapore is clearly not an underpowered city. If you go back to my thermometer, and you see that Singapore has perhaps uniquely the most concentrated form of self-government of any sort of urban region in the world, then Singapore has a particular leadership role in relation to this urbanizing century which we're halfway through. If you like, Singapore has the potential to reveal the benefits of capable city government and leadership, which all of us want to propose are important, but revealing them, if you like, Singapore is a kind of pathfinder for the world. Singapore also has this DNA around innovation. I spoke about water earlier on. It's how that DNA of innovation expresses itself in terms of the next set of tools of urban development and how we move beyond accepted sort of urban solutions that's key. And then the last 50 years, I think, has demonstrated Singapore's genuine ability to innovate. There is a high expectation that it will do so again. I think it would be great if in this conversation and the rest of the evening, we talked about where and how Singapore will innovate in the next cycle so that the rest of the world can be inspired by it. So thank you very much indeed. I hope that's tempted you at least to read the book.
Greg, thank you. Mark Thomas from Auckland Council. So just want to acknowledge the huge work that you did with the establishment of Auckland Council more than 6 years ago now. I'm based in Singapore now, and look, there's a lot of questions that could come from your talk, but perhaps the big one would be, you've analysed the sort of themes and trends over the histories of sort of urbanisation. So that's kind of relatively easy to do after the fact. In terms of the big trends now, I mean, which cities do you observe are the ones that are across the dominant trends and are kind of trying to do something with them. So city deal making, for example, I mean, that's certainly something we continue to struggle with, as you know. Of the emerging sort of shaping trends now, are there any cities that are best in class, that really are across the trends, that will shape the later part of that 100-year cycle that you talked about?
Well, it's always invidious to pick examples. And by the way, I should say that engaging with Auckland over a period of 15 years has been a really interesting part of my recent career. And having been, the external advisor on the Royal Commission that reformed the Auckland government, I sort of feel I learned a lot from helping a place that was effectively 6 parish councils plus a metro government actually become a unified city government. It was very, very interesting. You can't say that there are best in classes very easily, but clearly, aside from Singapore, whose virtues I've already extolled, name me another city of 10 million plus that's gone from being a low-income to a high-income city in 50 years, apart from Seoul. And I think that the lessons that come from Seoul around environmental management, around infrastructure investment, around the reuse of land, investment in education, reconfiguring the real estate system, all very, very, very useful. And despite the fact that politically and in governance terms Seoul has had problems, actually there's been some very wise things done there. Let's think of other medium-sized cities that have been able to become great generators not just of wealth, but of high quality of life. So obviously San Francisco, Stockholm, Tel Aviv start to come to mind as being places that have positioned themselves extremely well to be hubs of new technology, but with ever-increasing livability, notwithstanding the issue and the challenge of costs, which they all, of course, face. And then I think that you've got a series of cities in this kind of established World Cities bracket where interesting things are happening. Now, I happen to live in London, and I come from London, so obviously I'm a fiercely proud Londoner, and you can be very aware that, our daily media reel of the challenges we face is quite startling. But if you do a comparison of London and Paris and New York and Tokyo and ask the question, which city has invested most in their transport infrastructure over the last 20 years, actually by a very long way it's London. And I think it's been quite interesting that London's been able to do that despite having relatively low levels of self-government. So the further down my thermometer you are, the more you need to be able to generate and exercise soft power. The further up my thermometer you are, the more you have hard power in the form of the ability to capitalize your own infrastructure. So those are good examples. That's probably enough from me. I mean, there's 100 cities that I love, so I could literally talk for hours.
I think you mentioned a lot about technology, the shifting trade. And in your book, the key thing about global cities really centers around trade. Yeah. And we know that that's changing in the way things are happening, especially in Asia, for those of us here. I just came from Business China, 2 days of Business China, talking about BRIs and whatnot. So naturally, the key challenge, I think, for Singapore today is probably the emergence of this Silk Route. Silk Route likely to change the dynamics of how trading is going to happen. Yeah. It's going to change the way infrastructure is going to be seen across Asia. What do you think should Singapore be aware of in this rising tide of change, infrastructural change in the way that business is going to operate? Yeah. Are we losing our relevance in the world in terms of the global city status?
Well, in a sense, I was trying to comment on this question in my remarks, and I'll try and say it again now much more directly. By the way, I think it's important to observe this growth of exponential technologies as somehow reaching back into the 1970s and 80s. It's not a new thing. I think of the globalization of media as being something that accompanied the globalization of finance and professional services in the 80s and 90s. And that globalization of media led to the interaction between information systems and services and technology in a way that we didn't have before. And I think that created the backdrop, as it were, for this digital economy that's now emerging. So that would be one point. I do think it's true that the One Belt, One Road program, which of course includes the maritime routes as well as the territorial routes, which are very beneficial for Singapore, but that program is a big century play, recognizing, as it were, everything I said in my first slide about what this century is about. The One Belt, One Road program is a ambitious, bold, and I think in various ways clever program to really shape and manage that century. And I think that it will have the effect of putting on the global map lots of places that are not yet on it. It will create a new sense of centrality for those places that are on it. I happen to be very interested in Western China, spent quite a lot of time both in Chengdu and Chongqing, and I think for those cities, we will talk about them over the next 10 to 20 years as being really established global cities, and I think that the territorial road will play a key role there. Now for Singapore, I tried to say this in my last remarks, so if you like, Singapore has served, I'm using my language thoughtfully here, Singapore has served Asia-Pacific capitalism in the last 30 years by establishing itself as a place of livability for talent, with a good business climate for exchange, a good environment for corporates. If you like, the offer has been locate in Singapore and serve Asia-Pacific. It's been the kind of the underpinning of the strategy. And that was very smart, and it's, I think, produced huge dividends, right? And those huge dividends you can see in the resources you've been able to invest, the way your population has grown, how it's diversified, the companies that are based here, the clusters that you have. I think it's also reasonable to expect that the business climate and the livability equations in lots of other Asia-Pacific cities are going to catch up. And so it would not make sense to try to repeat in the next cycle or two the things you did in the cycle before. So the question from a strategic point of view is more, how does Singapore lead and service the next cycle? And so there's a huge amount of Singapore's ingenuity and expertise in education, in medicine, in high science, in certainly in the circular economy and water and land and those sorts of things, which are absolutely premium technologies and innovations and insights. So, you know, the strategy should be much more around Nobel Prizes than around transnational corporations, for example, I'd have thought. And the strategy then for Singapore, I think, is much more to figure out how it can service these major developments in terms of very knowledge-intensive, high innovation industries and high design industries. So what's the great thing about the Maritime Silk Road? Well, 100 cities need to be built. Who's expert at building cities? Singapore. So it's the way in which Singapore, I think, starts to articulate its role in advanced urban services, in the global circular economy, the way in which Singapore articulates its role in the experience economy as a place of decision-making, a place of gatherings, a place of soft diplomacy. I think all of those things will be very important. And that's slightly different from being an offshore business hub on the Asia-Pacific continent, which was never quite the strategy, but you know what I mean.
Yes, it's just, well, to me, I think, right? Where it is, because there's been a lot of arguments about positioning ourselves, Singapore, as infrastructural funding location, as you've seen in EDB's pamphlet, that Singapore can tap into the OBR through a financial positioning, and like you just described, there's more to it, urban solutions.
Well, and that would be a logical way of utilizing the cluster of institutional investors that you now have, wouldn't it, in a new way? So that would make sense to me. To shift from real estate finance to more broadly infrastructure finance, it would give you an even more interesting job as well.
Exactly, yes, perfect. All right, going back to you guys, some questions raised here. So here we go. Jane, thank you for the presentation. Could you explain more about Dubai? I find it quite interesting that it's located in the middle of the Venn.
Yes. So Dubai, I think, is identified by us as being the ultimate hybrid city, if you want to put it that way. If you accept our typology, which you may not accept, and all typologies are limited, you know, Dubai is part established world city because of the role that it plays in finance and business services for the Middle East, having taken over, as it were, from Mumbai as the main banking center for that region. It's got elements of that. Dubai is also, of course, an emerging world city because it's emerging at the time that its national economy and its regional economy are emerging. But it's also, of course, in a certain way, a new world city because it's trying to plug into being an area of specialization in some of those new high-tech sectors. So that's the reason it's geographically in the center of the diagram. But the center of the diagram isn't necessarily the best place to be, because this is a diagram that's trying to focus on the precise and specific strategies of different kinds of cities, given their asset endowment, their population, and their opportunities. And I would say, in another forum, perhaps in another way, the fact that it's in the center of the diagram, in a sense, means that the strategy for Dubai is not very clear.
Does it go the same with Taiwan? Because you have Taiwan just right below Dubai.
Yeah, well, the Taiwan strategy is still slightly locked in the old paradigm, if you like, of trying to be close to a market and service it in a very specific way, rather than updating its approach. And I think as well, that Taiwan suffers from some of the challenges that the emerging world cities have in terms of proving the quality of their environment, their ability to play host to high-order functions. So that's why it's there.
Second question, guest speaker mentioned at the start of his talk, this room do not have natural lighting, okay? Nobody corrected him. Could you please
ask the staff to raise the blinds? Okay. Good point.
Moving on then, you mentioned 5 key driving forces for world cities, tourism, trade. Do you think geography is still destiny for cities in the next phase?
Well, I'm a geographer in my heart somewhere, and so I believe that geography is the best way to understand what's happening with and within cities and to really get to the bottom of what their DNA is. If you like, there's a social and economic geography to cities as well as their physical geography and their locational position. But I'm constantly aware that geographies change, and particularly with the new generation of connective infrastructure. So we were just talking about One Belt, One Road. This is a big geography play, actually, for Western China and for the Stans and mid-Asia. This is about trying to change the way that global geography works without changing your location. And I'm also aware that obviously digital technologies in particular, but other technologies as well, change the way that distance performs and the way that distance articulates itself in relation to cities. So I think geography is a very important thing to understand, but I think it's equally important not to get trapped by geography. So we had a question earlier, didn't we, from Auckland, which is, relatively speaking, a city that has historically had the challenge of being relatively remote in a relatively small country where there are large distances to other major markets. The issue for Auckland is how do you turn all of that into an advantage?
Vote of 4 thumbs up. What's your view on having the high-speed rail linking Kuala Lumpur and Singapore? Will the mega twin city concept really take off to be able to compete globally?
I'm interested to know what you think about that, but I'm in the middle of a study of a number of regions around the world where increased connectivity between neighboring cities has been done as a deliberate sort of policy play, and trying to ask the question, what are the effects, as it were, overall, but what are the individual effects in different geographies around those locations? So I'm looking at the How Train in South Africa, looking at the impact of the Orison Bridge Tunnel between Copenhagen and Malmö. I'm looking at what happened when the BART rail system was first introduced in California and brought together San Francisco with Oakland and San Jose, and a range of other things, and looking back into the history of connectivity in the Netherlands and some of the other projects that are around, including the high-speed rail link in Scandinavia and various others. There are about 20 projects around in the world at the moment that have some similarity to the Kuala Lumpur, Singapore proposition. Well, I think that the first thing that we learn is that if you're in the business of competing with scale, then connectivity is a way of creating borrowed scale. We know that, right? And borrowed scale is advantageous if you want to, as it were, perform better in some of these visibility measures around your higher education institutions, or the scale of your labor market, or the depth of your logistics platform. If you're interested in those things, borrowed scale really helps you. The second thing we observe is that when you improve the connectivity of two places like this, there are cyclical dynamics to how those places adjust. So a good story perhaps is the Copenhagen-Malmö story. Obviously, these are different, smaller places than Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. But in the first cycle of that improved connectivity, there was a corporate consolidation in Copenhagen. So as it were, Malmö lost out. Jobs left Malmö and went to Copenhagen as a consequence of the connectivity. But in the second cycle of that, people realize that there's this place that's only 15, 20 minutes away where you've got affordable homes, wonderful business space, great industrial land that's not being used very well, and Malmö then became, as it were, the industrial district of the combined Copenhagen-Malmö region. So I think that the question is always, what are going to be the adjustments that are required as a result of enhanced connectivity? Are we ready to make those adjustments? And are we able to foresee what some of them might be, so that in this case, both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur could benefit? Now, I can't see a scenario in my mind in which there are excessive negative impacts for Singapore from this connectivity, and I can see some advantages in terms of being better connected to Malaysia for all sorts of reasons. But I'd also like to stress that much of the innovation imperative that Singapore has had in the last 15 years has been something to do with needing to be self-reliant in a very defined territory. So you don't want to lose that innovation edge because you somehow become part of a larger landmass by increasing connectivity to it. So overall, I think it would be very positive, but it's important not as it were, to throw the baby out with the bathwater, not to lose some of the innovative edge that you have through doing it.
Right, and going back to that, I do agree that, in fact, if you look at it, the connectivity has always been there. It's always the air connectivity between Singapore and Malaysia. Sure. It's by
50
road.
minutes.
Yeah. So it's not going to affect that much or dilute the two cities. In fact, I think Singapore has to gain. Increasing the urban studies done that cities grow on the back of rising urbanization, suburbanization as well, as much as it was in the past. Yeah. So that kind of synergy may work in our benefit in the longer term, I think.
Well, I expect that it would. I expect that there will be all sorts of benefits from doing it, but I would just say not to see it as a panacea. So, for example, if you look at the development of the How train, the first high-speed train in Africa, where Tshwane, formerly Pretoria, Johannesburg, and Ekurhuleni became much better connected, people were expecting this to be associated with a large-scale kind of urban revival, and it didn't really happen yet. Now, it may still happen. So I think it's sometimes we have expectations that are not really justifiable, and sometimes we forget about the adjustments required to make the most of these infrastructure investments.
Singapore has been successful to its port and airport with One Belt, One Road. Is it likely that port and airport will be negatively impacted?
Depends, doesn't it? It depends upon the strategy that Singapore adopts to service the urbanization and industrialization of Asia-Pacific more generally, but also mid-Asia and Western China more precisely. So I'd have thought that the maritime Silk Road is going to benefit the port of Singapore anyway. Singapore port is one of the major ports in the region. The maritime Silk Road will simply, I would have thought, enhance activity. The territorial Silk Road, the rail, I think the issue there is going to be what part of that does Singapore want to service and why. It's a tactical question about to what extent is that a customer for Singapore and how do you want to serve it. And I think that requires a little bit of strategic activity. I don't think that will have a negative effect on Changi Airport. I don't see any scenario in which it does that. What it might do is lead to Changi wanting to have better routes into certain parts of Western China and mid-Asia, right? Think of it as a customer and as a destination market, not necessarily as a competitor.
Right. Going on to the next question, you've listed many city indices. What are the gaps in the matrix and potential new ways of looking at the numbers?
That's a great question, and we've just published a report that answers this question, because I'm very concerned that now that we have 317 indexes, the problem is this, that many of them are rooted in, for example, trying to inform the expat community, or they're rooted in a desire to support the global investor community, or to support the tourism and destination sort of marketing entities. They're not really designed to service the process of urbanization. So you'll find that there are growing numbers, obviously there are very large numbers in relation to business climate, corporate presence, global connectivity, skills base, affordability. Then I talked to you a little bit during the speech about how the livability rankings, there's about 70 of them now, are diverging. One group, one cluster is more focused on, as it were, the natural environment, another cluster on the social environment, a third one much more looking at the social and democratic health of cities as a measure of livability. Then there's another group obviously emerging around the innovation economy. There are three areas where I think that there's not enough work being done in the indexes. Number one, you won't be surprised to hear me say, is to do with degrees of self-government and good government. Yeah, so if you like, my simple thermometer should become, I think, something that large numbers of people pay attention to. What's the degree of self-government of cities? Why does it matter? How does it affect them? It would be great to try to create some kind of race to the top here in terms of levels of self-government of cities, so that more cities are more able to act on their own behalves. The second one is rather obviously inequality. There are very few beyond Gini coefficients that properly measure participation, equality, inequality in cities, and this is obviously a rising and very important issue. And then the third one, where it would be good to see much more happening in this area, is the role of cities in terms of collaboration and dissemination of innovation. Although we know that, I could just about produce a ranking of the cities that are most involved in collaborative networks. That's only really some kind of simplistic proxy. Actually, it would be good to know which cities are actually really trading in the business of supporting urbanization as a process by helping other cities to expand and develop. I imagine that's a kind of measure where Singapore would do extremely well given the efforts that are done here, but we don't have a way of measuring that. So collaborative capacity would be a really interesting thing. So I would say those are the ones: self-government, inequality, collaborative capacity. They're largely absent. A lot of the work that's done on sustainability, comparing sustainability, is done with a very short-term framework, measuring, as it were, the easily measurable. It's not very thoughtful about social sustainability or about long-term resilience particularly.
One question that rose to the top, I think we have to address that, because global city needs to be a smart city.
Well, it depends whether you like the idea of a smart city. The problem with the term smart city is that it's slightly ambiguous, and as you probably know, there are different camps emerging around the world on whether the term smart city is useful or not. Let me just summarize that for you very quickly by saying that if by smart city we mean smart citizens, and we mean smart city government, and we mean smart systems, and we mean the interoperability of systems, the way in which integration occurs, so that from the point of view of the citizen as a customer, it's more easy to navigate the city. And if we mean that the city becomes more efficient because it's more able to reduce losses and wastage and those sorts of things, then I think everybody's in favor of smart cities. But the problem has been that unwittingly and probably unintentionally, the smart city brand has become tied up with particular IT solutions that particular companies might be trying to sell to particular cities, whether or not that city is ready to make the most of that IT platform, whether it's actually the solution to the problem that they have, and whether it fits in with their developmental path. So the consequence has been that there's been some negative reaction to the term smart city, and it's really kind of thought of as a kind of corporate solutions brand rather than something that cities themselves are adopting. Now, of course, it's very mixed, because in different continents of the world, there's different degrees of passing through this cycle of loving and then hating smart cities. So I don't want to assume that, that everybody's coming from the same place on this. Of course, we're talking much more now about future cities, and we're talking more about resilient cities, we're talking more about flexible cities, and we're also talking more about intelligent cities. And anyone like me who's been involved in cities for sort of 30 years knows there's at least 250 brand names for what's a good city. When I first started, it was all about creative cities, then it became sustainable cities, then it became entrepreneurial cities. So I think the thing is, don't worry about labels. Try to create the environments in which cities work better for their citizens.
Has 5 votes. Do you think Trump has contributed to the discussion on globalization more than any other US president has done due to his stance on anti-globalization? Okay, that's kind of paradox.
That's a kind of interesting question, isn't it? Because I suppose it requires you to say, has he contributed to a discussion? Or has he just said something? I don't wish to be disrespectful to anyone who's a supporter of Donald Trump or indeed the President of the US. I think that, let me put this more broadly. I think, as I tried to say in my speech, that the current cycle of populism and the anti-global dimension within it is something that we have to take seriously, and I think it has within it the seeds of some very important corrective insights that we do need to understand and adopt. And those corrective insights are about, in a sense, the unmanaged externalities that are associated with global urbanization. And in particular, as I tried to say in my presentation, it's to do with the impact in the geographies beyond the city, as it were, the growth in regional disparities, if I can use that language. It's to do with inequality within the global city, which is a very important thing to address. And it's also to do with what I would see as the fundamental challenge of how do nation states adjust socially to a much more integrated, globalized and competitive world. And in particular, that means a revolution in terms of education and skills and aspirations. So, if you like, the places that tend to vote for anti-globalization policies tend to be the regions with the lower skilled populations, right? And the reasons that they vote for anti-globalization policies is because they feel exposed, they feel competed with, they feel that their jobs have been taken away, and we have to take that very seriously. So, but for me, the response to that should not be, as it were, let's cancel globalization, which I don't think you can do in one country, and I think it's very difficult to do it at all for the reasons I mentioned. But what it will require is for the global city enthusiast amongst us to develop a much more nuanced policy position that I try to set out in that slide. And for the national governments, it requires adjusting particularly their education systems and their training systems to a much more flat world, a much more competitive world, a world where there are greater sources of competition, and a world in which these ubiquitous technologies that I spoke about are going to have a very big effect in destroying low-skill, low-innovation jobs, as we know. So being ready for that cycle of global development is going to be very important. And the anti-globalists, I think, are not going to be able to retard the pace at which technology permeates our lives and changes the structure of labor markets and of jobs. So this is why I don't think that the anti-globalization forces will occasion a sustained retrenchment. But I do think we should have that more intelligent conversation that the questioner was asking about. I'm just not sure that Mr. Trump is doing an awful lot to stimulate it and contribute to it. At least he's creating an environment in which we need to have it. Let's put it that way.